The sound of breaking glass jolted Nora Valens from her sleep just before dawn, sending her heart racing and her body into immediate alertness. She fumbled for the rifle her father had left her, fingers closing around the cool metal as she strained her ears for further disturbance. Living alone on the edge of Promise Creek, Wyoming territory in 1876 meant that any unexpected noise could spell trouble. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. Silence answered her. Slowly, Nora climbed from her bed, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her bare feet. The cool September air sent goosebumps across her skin as she moved cautiously toward her small kitchen, rifle raised and ready. The first rays of morning sun filtered through the window, illuminating shards of broken glass scattered across the floor. Nora's gaze fell upon a rock wrapped in a piece of paper that had clearly been thrown through the window. With trembling fingers, she picked it up, unfolding the note to reveal a crudely written message. "Get out. This land ain't for women alone." Nora's jaw tightened. 3 years she'd lived here since her father passed, running the small horse ranch he'd built. 3 years of struggle, of proving herself capable to a town that thought a woman couldn't manage on her own. And now, this. She tossed the paper onto the table and swept up the glass, refusing to let fear take root. Tomorrow was her 24th birthday, and she'd be damned if some coward's threat would ruin that, even if she'd be spending it alone as usual. Miles away, Xavier Thornton guided his horse along a rarely used trail toward Promise Creek. His broad shoulders ached from the days spent in the saddle, and his weathered face showed the toll of his 30 years, most spent under the harsh western sun. His dark hair fell in waves beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and a week's worth of stubble darkened his jaw. The sound of rushing water told him he was nearing the creek, and not a moment too soon. His canteen was nearly empty, and both he and his horse, Rusty, needed rest. Xander, as most people called him, had been riding for 2 weeks, putting distance between himself and the trouble he'd left behind in Colorado. As he rounded a bend, the glint of sunshine on water caught his eye, and he spotted a young woman kneeling by the creek's edge. She was filling a bucket, her chestnut hair falling in waves down her back. She worked quickly, efficiently, and there was something in her determined movements that made him pause. When she stood and turned, she startled at the sight of him, nearly dropping her bucket. "Sorry, madam," Xander said, raising one hand to show he meant no harm. "Didn't mean to frighten you." Nora's eyes narrowed as she assessed the stranger. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. His gun belt hung low on his hips, but his hands were well clear of his weapons. "You're on private property," she said, lifting her chin. "My apologies," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "I'm just looking to water my horse before heading into town." "Promise Creek is that way," Nora said, gesturing with her free hand. "About 3 miles. Xander nodded, noticing the tension in her stance. "Name's Xavier Thornton. Most folks call me Xander." "Nora Valens," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "This is my land you're crossing." "Well, Miss Valens, would you mind terribly if my horse and I took a moment to refresh ourselves before moving on?" Nora studied him for a long moment. There was something in his eyes, a weariness, perhaps, but also a kindness that made her relax slightly. "Fine," she said finally. "But I've got work to do. Don't linger." With that, she hoisted her bucket and began the walk back toward a small cabin and barn visible in the distance. Xander watched her go, noticing the rifle slung across her back and the determined set of her shoulders. This was a woman used to taking care of herself, and something about that intrigued him. He dismounted, leading Rusty to the water's edge. As the horse drank deeply, Xander splashed cool water on his face and refilled his canteen. His gaze drifted back to Nora Valens' retreating form. "Interesting woman," he murmured to Rusty, who flicked an ear in response. Nora tried to put the stranger from her mind as she returned to her chores. There was a fence in the north pasture that needed mending, and 2 of her horses required exercise. Then there were the regular daily tasks: feeding the chickens, tending her small vegetable garden, chopping wood for the approaching winter. But as she worked, her thoughts kept returning to Xavier Thornton. Strangers passing through wasn't unusual, but something about him had caught her attention. Perhaps it was simply that he'd treated her with respect, unlike most men she encountered who either pitied her or tried to convince her she needed their help to run her ranch. By mid-afternoon, Nora had finished most of her chores and was brushing down Willow, her favorite mare, when the sound of approaching hooves made her tense. Setting down the brush, she stepped out of the barn to see Xander approaching, his horse moving at a leisurely pace. "Mr. Thornton," she called out, crossing her arms, "I thought you were heading to town." "I was," he replied, halting Rusty a respectful distance away. "But it seems Promise Creek isn't as welcoming as I'd hoped." "No rooms at the boarding house?" "No rooms for someone who won't state his business to the entire saloon," Xander said with a rueful smile. Small towns and their curiosity. Nora understood that all too well. "So you've come back here because—" "I noticed you have a barn that could use some repair," he said, gesturing to the structure behind her where several boards had come loose in the last storm. "I thought perhaps we could make an arrangement. A few days' work in exchange for a corner of your barn to sleep in?" Nora's instinct was to refuse immediately. She'd managed on her own this long, and allowing a stranger to stay on her property seemed foolish. Yet the broken window from that morning nagged at her thoughts. Having a man around, even temporarily, might discourage whoever had threatened her. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Thornton?" "Bit of everything," he replied. "Worked cattle drives, did some carpentry, even tried my hand at mining for a spell. I'm good with horses, too." Nora considered this. An extra pair of hands would help, especially with winter coming. And something about his steady gaze told her he wasn't lying. "1 week," she said finally. "You can sleep in the tack room. First sign of trouble, and you're gone." Xander tipped his hat. "Yes, madam. You won't regret it." "I'd better not," Nora replied, returning to the barn. "You can start by fixing those loose boards." As Xander dismounted and began unloading his saddlebags, Nora wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But watching him move with quiet efficiency, handling the tools she provided with practiced ease, she felt a small sense of relief. Maybe having him around for a few days wouldn't be so bad after all. That evening, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread that they ate in awkward silence on opposite sides of her small kitchen table, Nora retired to her bedroom while Xander settled into the tack room in the barn. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of night, somehow comforted by the knowledge that she wasn't completely alone on her property for once. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Nora rose early, as was her habit, and was surprised to find Xander already up and tending to the horses. "Morning," he called when he spotted her. "Hope you don't mind. Thought I'd get an early start." "Not at all," she replied, noticing he'd already fed and watered not just his own horse but hers as well. "Thank you." He nodded, then gestured to the fence posts loaded on a small cart. "Thought I'd fix that section of fence in the north pasture today, if that suits you." Nora blinked, surprised he'd noticed the broken fence. "That would be helpful?" "Yes." "Good," he said with a smile that made something flutter in her chest. "Oh, and happy birthday, Miss Valens?" Nora froze. "How did you know?" "Calendar on your wall had today's date circled," he explained. "Seemed like it might be significant." She'd forgotten about that marking, made months ago in a moment of optimism that this year might be different, that this year someone might remember. Her father had always made a fuss over her birthdays, but since his passing, the day had gone largely unmarked. "Yes. Well, she said, feeling strangely awkward. It's just another day. Xander seemed to sense her discomfort and nodded. Of course. I'll get to that fence then. As he led the cart away, Nora found herself watching him go, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within her. It had been so long since anyone had wished her a happy birthday that the simple acknowledgement had caught her off guard. She went about her morning chores, trying to push aside the melancholy that always accompanied this date. By midday, she'd managed to convince herself it truly was just another day, and the fact that she would spend her birthday evening alone again was of no consequence. When Xander returned from the north pasture, his shirt damp with sweat and his arms bearing fresh scratches from the barbed wire, Nora felt a twinge of guilt for having him work so hard on her behalf. The fence is fixed, he reported, found a couple of other weak spots and reinforced those too. Thank you, she said, offering him a dipper of water from the well. You didn't have to do all that. He shrugged, drinking deeply before responding. I like to be thorough. Besides, it's not like I had other plans for the day. His easy smile made her own lips curve upward in response. There's stew for dinner, she said. It'll be ready at sundown. Xander nodded. I look forward to it. In the meantime, I noticed your chicken coop could use some attention. And so the day continued, with Xander moving from one task to the next with tireless energy, and Nora finding herself increasingly grateful for his presence. By late afternoon, she realized with surprise that she'd accomplished more with his help than she typically managed in 3 days on her own. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Nora stirred the stew one final time and cut thick slices of bread to accompany it. She set the table, adding a small bunch of late-blooming wildflowers she'd gathered from the edge of her garden as a small birthday indulgence. She was just about to call Xander in for dinner when she realized he hadn't returned from his latest task replacing a broken latch on the root cellar. Frowning, Nora stepped onto her porch, scanning the property. Mr. Thornton? She called. No answer came. The barn door stood open, but there was no sign of movement within. The chicken coop was secure, the horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. An uneasy feeling settled in Nora's stomach. Had he left? It seemed unlikely, given how hard he'd worked all day, but men had disappointed her before. Returning inside, Nora tried to ignore the pang of disappointment. She'd grown accustomed to his presence surprisingly quickly. And the thought of spending her birthday evening alone again was more depressing than she cared to admit. She was just about to serve herself a bowl of stew when a knock sounded at the door. Nora opened it to find Xander standing there, his hair damp and his face freshly shaved. He'd changed into a clean shirt, and in his arms was a bouquet of wildflowers, not the small scraggly ones she'd gathered, but a lush arrangement of late summer blooms in vibrant yellows and purples. I hope I'm not late for dinner, he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she hadn't heard before. Nora stared at him, then at the flowers. What's this? For your table, he explained, offering them to her. And for your birthday. I know you said it's just another day, but... He trailed off, suddenly looking uncertain. Nora accepted the flowers, their sweet scent enveloping her as she buried her face in them to hide the sudden rush of emotion. It had been years since anyone had given her a gift, let alone one so thoughtful. Thank you, she said finally, looking up to meet his eyes. They're beautiful. The smile that spread across his face warmed her more than she cared to admit. I'm glad you like them. I found them growing along the creek bank. Nora invited him in, placing the flowers in the center of the table alongside her own meager gathering. The contrast was stark, his bouquet full and vibrant, hers small and simple, yet somehow they complemented each other perfectly. As they sat down to dinner, the usual awkwardness between them seemed to have dissipated. Xander asked about her horses, and Nora found herself talking more than she had in months, describing each animal's personality and quirks, with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. "You really love them," Xander observed as he helped himself to another serving of stew. "They're family," Nora replied simply. "My father taught me everything I know about horses. He always said they're better judges of character than most people." "Smart man," Xander said. "And what do your horses think of me?" Nora smiled despite herself. "Willow let you brush her, and she doesn't typically take to strangers. That's high praise from her." "I'm honored," he said with a soft laugh. "Your father taught you well. This is one of the best-run small ranches I've seen." Pride swelled in Nora's chest at the compliment. "It hasn't been easy, especially since he passed, but I couldn't bear to sell the place. It's all I have left of him." Xander's expression softened. "How long has it been?" 3 years next month," Nora said, the familiar ache of loss resurging briefly. "Pneumonia took him after a particularly harsh winter." "I'm sorry," Xander said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice touched her. "Losing family is never easy." "No," she agreed. "But enough about that. Tell me what brings you to Promise Creek. You're clearly running from something." Xander's eyebrows rose. "What makes you say that?" "The way you keep checking behind you when you think I'm not looking," Nora said. "And the fact that you didn't want to announce your business to the town. I'm not judging, we've all got our secrets, but I'd like to know if trouble's likely to follow you to my door." For a long moment, Xander was silent, studying her with those intense eyes. Then he sighed. "Fair enough. I was a deputy marshal in a small town near Denver. There was a local rancher, powerful man named Harlan Reeves, who thought the law didn't apply to him. When his son got drunk and killed a young woman in a riding accident, Reeves expected me to look the other way." Nora's eyes widened. "But you didn't." "No," Xander said grimly. "I arrested the son. But Reeves has friends in high places. The charges were dismissed, and suddenly I found myself accused of taking bribes. Marshal, who hired me, was forced to let me go, and Reeves made it clear I wasn't welcome to stick around." "So you're running from false accusations?" "I'm looking for a fresh start," he corrected. "Somewhere my reputation won't precede me. And yes, I'm keeping a low profile because Reeves has been known to send men after those who cross him." Nora absorbed this information, noting the tension in Xander's shoulders as he spoke. "Do you think he'd go to that much trouble over you?" "I hope not," Xander replied honestly, "but I'd rather be cautious, which is why I haven't told anyone in town my full story." "Except me," Nora pointed out. A small smile touched his lips. "Except you. I figure you deserve to know who's sleeping in your barn." The honesty in his voice reassured her. Whatever his past troubles, Xander Thornton didn't strike her as a dangerous man, at least, not to her. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "And for the flowers. It's been a while since anyone remembered my birthday." "That's a shame," Xander said softly. "You deserve to be remembered." "Nora Valens." The way he said her name sent an unexpected warmth through her. For the first time in years, Nora felt seen not as a stubborn woman clinging to her father's legacy, but as herself. Later that night, after Xander had returned to the barn and Nora had blown out her lamp, she found herself lying awake, thinking about the unexpected turn her birthday had taken. The wildflowers on her table, now arranged in her mother's old vase, had brought color and life to her small cabin. But it was the man who had brought them that occupied her thoughts as she drifted into sleep. The next morning, Nora woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a disoriented moment, she thought she must be dreaming. It had been years since anyone had cooked breakfast for her. Pulling on her robe, she ventured into the kitchen to find Xander at her stove, expertly flipping flapjacks. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "Hope you don't mind. Thought you deserved a day off after your birthday." I... Nora was momentarily speechless. "Thank you. But you didn't have to do this." "Wanted to," he replied simply, sliding a perfectly browned flapjack onto a plate. Coffee's ready if you'd like some. Still somewhat dazed, Nora poured herself a cup and sat at the table, watching as Xander moved about her kitchen with unexpected grace. There was something strangely intimate about having someone cook in her space, yet it didn't feel like an intrusion. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Thornton," she said after taking a sip of coffee. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," he answered, bringing plates to the table. She insisted all her sons know how to fend for themselves. Said no woman should have to take care of a man who can't even make his own breakfast. "Wise woman," Nora said with a smile. "How many brothers do you have?" "Two," Xander replied, joining her at the table. "Both older. One's a doctor in St. Louis now. The other runs the family farm back in Missouri." "And you became a lawman instead of a farmer?" He shrugged. "Never had the patience for watching things grow. Preferred to keep moving." A wry smile touched his lips. "Though I'm beginning to see the appeal of putting down roots." Something in the way he looked at her as he said this made Nora's heart skip a beat. She quickly focused on her breakfast to hide the flush creeping into her cheeks. The flapjacks were delicious, light and fluffy, and the bacon perfectly crisp. "This is wonderful," she admitted between bites. "Thank you." "My pleasure," Xander replied. "So what needs doing today?" Nora hesitated. In truth, he'd already accomplished most of the pressing repairs she'd been putting off. "You've done so much already." "I'm here for the week, remember?" he reminded her. "Unless you've changed your mind about wanting my help." "No," she said quickly. "It's just, I'm not used to having help. Usually, I have to prioritize what absolutely must be done and let the rest wait." Xander nodded in understanding. "Well then, let's tackle some of what's been waiting. What about that loose shingle on your roof? Saw it flapping in the wind yesterday." Nora had been avoiding that particular repair for months, not being overly fond of heights. "That would be helpful?" "Yes." And so another day of work began, with Xander climbing onto her roof while Nora tended to her horses. By mid-morning, the September sun had warmed the air enough that Xander had removed his shirt, revealing a torso muscled from years of physical labor and marked with several scars that hinted at past struggles. Nora found herself stealing glances at him as she worked, surprised by her own interest. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to think of any man as more than potentially useful or potentially threatening. But there was something about Xander Thornton that broke through the careful walls she'd built. At noon, they paused for a simple lunch of leftover stew and bread. Sitting in the shade of her porch, Nora found herself relaxing in his company, their conversation flowing more easily than it had the day before. "So how did you end up running this place on your own?" Xander asked. "Most women in your position would have sold up after losing their father." "Most women haven't spent their entire lives learning to run a ranch," Nora countered. "Besides, where would I go? This is my home." "No other family?" Nora shook her head. "Mother died when I was 12. No siblings. My father was everything to me: parent, teacher, friend." She gazed out at the paddock where her horses grazed. "After he died, the banker in town, Mr. Peterson, tried to convince me to sell. Said a woman couldn't manage alone. I was determined to prove him wrong." "Seems like you have," Xander observed. "Some days are harder than others," Nora admitted. "The townsfolk weren't exactly supportive at first. Some still aren't." She thought of the broken window, the threatening note. "But most have come around, or at least learned to leave me be." "Except whoever threw that rock through your window," Xander said quietly. Nora's head snapped up. "How did you know about that?" "Saw the new glass you put in," he explained. "It doesn't quite match the rest of the pane, and there were fragments in your flower bed that you missed." "You notice a lot," Nora said, unsure whether to be impressed or unnerved by his observation skills. Comes with the territory, he replied. Who do you think did it? Nora sighed. Could be anyone. There's a faction in town that thinks a woman living alone is unnatural. Or it could be the Wilcox brothers. They've been trying to buy up land around here for years. Have you reported it to the local sheriff? Sheriff Miller is more interested in keeping the peace at the saloon than protecting outlying properties, Nora said with a touch of bitterness. Especially those owned by stubborn women, as he calls me. Xander's expression darkened. That's not right. Welcome to Promise Creek, Nora said dryly, where progress means a new shipment of whiskey at the general store. Is that why you stay out here instead of living in town? Xander asked. To avoid their judgment? I stay because I love this land, Nora corrected him. The solitude suits me. She paused, then added more quietly. Most of the time. Xander studied her for a long moment. You're an extraordinary woman, Nora Valens. The simple compliment, spoken with such sincerity, caught her off guard. I'm just doing what needs to be done, she said, rising to her feet to hide her flustered reaction. We should get back to work. But as they returned to their respective tasks, Nora found herself pondering his words and the way they had made her feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The afternoon passed quickly, with Xander finishing the roof repair and moving on to splitting firewood, while Nora mended tack and checked her garden for any late vegetables ready for harvesting. The easy rhythm they fell into felt strangely natural, as if they'd been working alongside each other for years rather than days. As dusk approached, Nora was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she heard the distant sound of approaching horses. Setting down her basket, she moved to the edge of the barn for a better view, tensing when she recognized the riders. 3 men on horseback were coming up the road that led to her property, Clyde Wilcox, and 2 of his ranch hands. Nora's stomach tightened. The Wilcox family owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and they'd made no secret of their desire to absorb her small horse ranch into their holdings. Xander appeared at her side, alerted by the sound as well. Trouble? He asked quietly. Potentially, Nora replied, unconsciously moving closer to him. That's Clyde Wilcox and his men. They're not exactly friendly visitors. Xander's posture shifted subtly, his hand drifting toward the gun at his hip before he seemed to think better of it. Want me to make myself scarce? Nora considered this. Having Xander present might deter whatever intimidation Wilcox had planned, but it could also escalate the situation. Before she could decide, the riders were upon them, halting their horses in the yard. Afternoon, Miss Valens, Clyde called out, his tone falsely pleasant. He was a stocky man in his 40s, with a perpetual sneer and small, calculating eyes that now fixed on Xander with obvious suspicion. I see you've got company. Mr. Wilcox? Nora acknowledged coolly. What brings you to my property? Clyde dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. Just being neighborly. Heard there might have been some trouble out this way. Thought I'd check on you. Nora's eyes narrowed. The rock through her window had only happened yesterday morning, and she hadn't told anyone in town. How would Wilcox know unless— That's very considerate, she said, her voice laced with skepticism. But as you can see, everything's fine. Clyde's gaze traveled from Nora to Xander, taking in the latter's protective stance beside her. And who might this be? Xavier Thornton, Xander replied before Nora could speak. I'm helping Miss Valens with some repairs. Is that right? Clyde's eyes hardened. Funny, I don't recall seeing you around Promise Creek before. Just passing through, Xander said easily. Fortunate timing for Miss Valens, as some of these repairs were rather urgent. The implied knowledge of the broken window hung in the air between them. Clyde's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, he said after a moment, it's good you found some help, Miss Valens. Though I'm still of the opinion that this place is too much for a woman to manage. He swept his arm to indicate the property. My offer still stands. Good price, cash money. You could set yourself up comfortably in town. And I'm still not interested in selling, Nora replied firmly. But thank you for your concern, Mr. Wilcox. Was there anything else? Clyde stepped closer, lowering his voice. You can't hold out forever, Nora. A woman alone out here, it's not safe. Things happen. Windows break. Fences get cut. Horses wander off. The thinly veiled threat made Nora's blood boil. But before she could respond, Xander moved slightly forward, placing himself between her and Wilcox. Miss Valens isn't alone at the moment, he said quietly. And I'd take it as a personal favor if you'd keep that in mind before making any more observations about safety. The tension between the two men was palpable. Clyde was the first to break eye contact, stepping back with a forced laugh. Just trying to be helpful. No need to get defensive. He turned to Nora. Think about my offer, Miss Valens. Won't be on the table forever. With that, he remounted his horse and, with a final calculating look at Xander, led his men back down the road. When they were out of earshot, Nora released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Well, now we know who threw the rock. Seems likely, Xander agreed, his eyes still tracking the departing riders. Man like that doesn't take kindly to being refused. He's been trying to buy this land for 2 years, Nora said, anger sharpening her voice. Started making offers within a month of my father's passing, like a vulture circling. Xander turned to face her, his expression grave. You should be careful, Nora. Men like Wilcox don't give up easily when they want something. I'm always careful, she replied, but I won't be bullied off my land. A smile touched Xander's lips. No, I don't imagine you would be. Still, maybe I should extend my stay beyond the week, just until we're sure Wilcox has moved on to other interests. Nora's heart gave an unexpected leap at the suggestion, which she quickly tamped down. I managed before you arrived, Mr. Thornton. I'll manage after you leave. I don't doubt it, he said. But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered. Their eyes met, and Nora found herself unable to look away from the genuine concern in his gaze. It had been so long since anyone had worried about her welfare that she'd almost forgotten how it felt. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. We'll see, she said finally. 1 week was our agreement. Let's start there. Xander nodded, respecting her decision, though she could tell he was still troubled by Wilcox's visit. Fair enough. Now, how about I finish that firewood while you prepare dinner? I'm afraid my cooking skills are limited to breakfast foods. The tension of the moment broken, Nora found herself smiling. I think I can manage dinner. But tomorrow, you're teaching me how to make those flapjacks. Deal. Xander agreed with a grin that made her heart flutter traitorously in her chest. As she headed back to the house, Nora fought the impulse to look over her shoulder at him. It wouldn't do to become dependent on Xavier Thornton's presence, no matter how comforting it might be. He was passing through, as he'd said himself. Soon enough, she'd be alone again, and she needed to remember that. Still, as she began preparing dinner, she couldn't help but glance out the window to where he was working, his rhythmic movements as he split wood somehow reassuring. Having him here made her ranch feel more like a home than it had in years, and that realization was as unsettling as it was pleasant. The next few days fell into a comfortable pattern. Mornings began with breakfast together, Xander gradually teaching Nora his mother's recipes as promised. They would then tackle the day's work, he focusing on repairs and improvements, she handling the livestock and household tasks. Evenings were spent in increasingly easy conversation over dinner, followed by quiet hours where Xander would whittle small figurines by the fire while Nora mended clothes or read from one of her precious books. It was a simple routine, unremarkable in its domesticity. Yet Nora found herself looking forward to each day with an eagerness she hadn't felt in years. Xander's presence filled a void she hadn't fully acknowledged, and his quiet strength and surprising gentleness were slowly eroding the walls she'd built around herself. For his part, Xander seemed equally content in their arrangement. The wariness that had marked his expression when they first met gradually gave way to a relaxed ease. He smiled more, laughed often, and occasionally caught her eye in a way that made her pulse quicken. On the 5th day of his stay, they rode out together to check the property's boundaries, a task Nora typically performed alone. The autumn air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue overhead, as their horses carried them across rolling grassland dotted with stands of aspen turning golden in the September sun. "It's beautiful country," Xander observed as they paused at the western edge of her property, overlooking a valley where a stream wound its way through willows. "I can see why you fought to keep it. My father always said we were blessed to find this place," Nora replied, her eyes taking in the familiar vista with fresh appreciation. "He had plans to expand, maybe breed racehorses one day. Dreams that died with him. But you've kept his legacy alive," Xander said. "That counts for something." "I suppose," Nora agreed. "Though sometimes I wonder if he'd be disappointed that I haven't done more with the place. Just maintaining it takes all my energy." Xander turned in his saddle to face her, his expression earnest. "I didn't know your father, but I can't imagine him being disappointed in you, Nora. What you've accomplished here, on your own, it's remarkable." The sincerity in his voice warmed her more than the autumn sun. "Thank you," she said softly. "It helps to hear that sometimes." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Nora felt something shift between them, a subtle change in the air that made her both nervous and exhilarated. Before either could speak further, however, a gunshot echoed in the distance, making both of them tense. "Hunters, maybe?" Nora suggested, though hunting season was still weeks away. Xander frowned, scanning the horizon. "Maybe. Or Wilcox's men marking territory." A second shot, closer this time, seemed to confirm his suspicion. "We should head back," he said, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle in his saddle holster. Nora nodded, turning her horse. As they rode, she caught Xander repeatedly glancing behind them, his posture alert and watchful. It struck her that he'd slipped easily back into his role as lawman, despite no longer wearing a badge. "You miss it, don't you?" she asked as they neared the ranch buildings. "Being a deputy." Xander looked surprised by her observation. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I believed in what I was doing, protecting people, upholding the law. But the law isn't always just, as I learned the hard way." "Is that why you haven't sought another position somewhere else? You could be a deputy in another town, away from Reeves's influence." "I've thought about it," he said, "but trust isn't easily rebuilt once it's broken. I need to decide if that's a path I want to try walking again." "And what path are you considering instead?" Nora asked, curious about his plans. A small smile curved his lips. "I'm still figuring that out. But I'm starting to think it might involve putting down those roots I mentioned before." Something in his gaze as he said this made Nora's heart skip a beat. She looked away, focusing on guiding her horse through the gate to the paddock. "Well, you've certainly proven yourself handy around a ranch," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "Is that a job offer, Miss Valens?" he teased, dismounting and coming around to help her down from her horse. His hands at her waist sent a jolt of awareness through her as he lifted her effortlessly to the ground. For a moment, he didn't release her, their bodies close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. I couldn't afford to pay you what you're worth," Nora stammered, flustered by his proximity. "There are some things worth more than money," Xander replied softly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Before she could respond, the sound of an approaching wagon broke the moment. Xander stepped back, his hands dropping from her waist as they both turned toward the noise. A familiar wagon was coming up the road, Martha Wilson, who ran the general store in town with her husband, occasionally delivered supplies to outlying ranches. Nora smoothed her hair, aware of a flush in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the day's ride. "Wasn't expecting a delivery today," she murmured. "Maybe it's news," Xander suggested, already moving to help with the horses. Martha Wilson was a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s who had been one of the few townsfolk to support Nora after her father's death. As her wagon drew up to the house, she waved energetically. "Nora, dear, I brought your order and some gossip to go with it," she called out, then noticed Xander emerging from the barn. Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "And who might this handsome fellow be?" "Martha, this is Xavier Thornton," Nora said, approaching the wagon. "He's been helping me with some repairs." "Has he indeed?" Martha replied with a knowing smile that made Nora blush. "Well, it's about time you had some assistance out here, my dear. I've been telling you for ages that you work too hard alone." Xander stepped forward to help Martha down from the wagon. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wilson. Let me help with those supplies." "Such manners!" Martha exclaimed, clearly charmed. "You've found yourself a good one, Nora." We're not," Nora began, flustered. "Mr. Thornton is just passing through." "If you say so, dear," Martha replied with a wink that suggested she didn't believe a word of it. "Now, come help me unload these goods, and I'll tell you the news from town." As they transferred supplies from the wagon to Nora's pantry, Martha kept up a steady stream of chatter, punctuated by approving glances at Xander whenever he carried something particularly heavy. But it wasn't until they were enjoying coffee at Nora's kitchen table that Martha delivered the news she'd been saving. "Sheriff Miller arrested 2 of Clyde Wilcox's men this morning," she said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Caught them red-handed trying to intimidate the Jenkins family into selling their farm. Seems Wilcox has been making threats all over the county, not just to you." Nora's eyes widened. "The sheriff actually arrested Wilcox's men? That's unexpected." "Apparently, some anonymous letter reached the county judge last week, detailing Wilcox's activities," Martha continued. "Judge Harmon rode into town yesterday and had a long talk with Miller. Suddenly, our sheriff remembered he had sworn to uphold the law for everyone, not just Wilcox's friends." Xander, who had been listening quietly, asked, "What's likely to happen to the men?" "Judge Harmon's keeping them locked up until he holds a proper hearing next week," Martha replied. "But the real news is that Wilcox himself is being investigated now. Seems those men were willing to talk once they realized the judge wasn't going to let Miller release them quietly." Nora exchanged a glance with Xander, noting the satisfaction in his eyes. "That is good news," she said, "though I doubt it'll be the end of Wilcox's ambitions." "Perhaps not," Martha agreed, "but it might make him think twice about his methods." She sipped her coffee, then added casually, "By the way, there's been talk in town about a stranger helping you out here. Quite the stir it's caused." "I can imagine," Nora said dryly. "Most folks are just glad you've got someone looking out for you," Martha assured her, "especially with Wilcox causing trouble. Though I will say, Mrs. Peterson from the bank was most disapproving of your living arrangements." "Mrs. Peterson disapproves of my existence in general," Nora replied with a slight smile. "I'd be more concerned if she suddenly approved of something I did." Martha laughed heartily. "True enough. Well, I should be getting back before dark. Thomas will be wondering where I've gotten to." She rose, gathering her shawl. "Don't be strangers in town, you two. And Nora, do bring Mr. Thornton to the harvest dance next weekend. It's been too long since you joined in any social events." After seeing Martha off, Nora and Xander stood in the yard watching the wagon recede down the road. The mention of the harvest dance hung between them, unaddressed but present nonetheless. "Interesting timing about those arrests," Nora said finally, glancing at Xander. "An anonymous letter to the judge, you say?" A slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. Seems someone in Promise Creek has a sense of justice after all. Xander, Nora said slowly, realization dawning. Did you write to Judge Harmon? He shrugged, neither confirming nor denying. I may have taken a ride into the next county yesterday while you were visiting your mare at the Jenkins farm, and I might have had some observations to share about certain activities in Promise Creek. You went behind my back, Nora said, though there was no real accusation in her tone, just wonder. I went through proper legal channels to address a problem, Xander corrected gently. Sometimes the law works as it should, if given the chance. Nora studied him, taking in his calm assurance and the principle that clearly guided his actions. You're still every inch a lawman, badge or no badge. Some habits are hard to break, he acknowledged. Are you angry? Angry? Nora shook her head, a smile breaking across her face. Xander, you may have just done more to protect my ranch than I've managed in 2 years of standing my ground. The relief in his expression was palpable. I should have told you what I was planning. I'm sorry for that. No, Nora said, stepping closer to him. You did what you thought was right, and you were correct. I'm grateful. They stood there in the fading light, close enough that Nora could see the flecks of gold in Xander's hazel eyes. Something shifted between them again, that same electricity she'd felt earlier by the paddock, but stronger now. For a breathless moment she thought he might kiss her, and was startled to realize how much she wanted him to. Instead, Xander gently touched her cheek, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. We should get inside before it gets dark, he said softly. I promised to help with dinner tonight, remember? Right, Nora replied, trying to ignore the disappointment that mingled with her relief. Dinner. As they walked toward the house, Xander's hand brushed against hers, and for a brief moment, their fingers entwined before separating again. It was a small gesture, easily dismissed as accidental, yet Nora knew it was anything but. Just as she knew that whatever was growing between them would need to be addressed soon before his week at her ranch came to an end. That evening, as they prepared dinner side by side in her small kitchen, Nora found herself acutely aware of every movement Xander made, every accidental brush of his arm against hers, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling autumn air. Martha seems nice, Xander commented as he chopped vegetables. A good friend to have. She is, Nora agreed, one of the few who supported me staying here after Father died. She and Thomas have been kind bringing supplies when weather made the trip to town difficult, spreading word when I had horses ready to sell. And now she wants you to attend the harvest dance, Xander observed with a small smile. With me, apparently. Nora focused intently on the stew she was stirring. Martha enjoys matchmaking. Pay her no mind. And if I wanted to mind? Xander asked, his voice dropping lower. If I wanted to escort you to this dance? Nora's hand stilled on the spoon. Slowly she turned to face him, finding him much closer than she'd realized. Why would you want that? I think you know why, Nora, he said quietly. His eyes held hers, open and honest in a way that made her breath catch. These past days with you, they've meant something to me, more than I expected. Heart hammering in her chest, Nora struggled to find words. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to be vulnerable with anyone, to consider any future beyond the next season on her ranch. The idea of acknowledging her growing feelings for Xander was terrifying. You're leaving soon, she reminded him, her voice barely above a whisper. Back to your life, wherever that takes you. What if I don't want to leave? Xander asked, setting down his knife to give her his full attention. What if I've found something here worth staying for? The implication hung in the air between them, impossible to ignore. Nora swallowed hard, fighting the hope that threatened to bloom in her chest. You barely know me. I know enough, Xander countered. I know you're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever met. I know you love this land with a fierceness that's breathtaking. I know your smile makes my day brighter and your laughter is a sound I want to hear for a very long time. Tears prickled unexpectedly at the corners of Nora's eyes. No one had spoken to her like this before with such sincere admiration and affection. Xander, she began, not sure what she wanted to say. I'm not asking for promises, he said quickly. Just come to the dance with me. Give us a chance to see if there might be something worth building here. The simplicity of the request, and the hope in his eyes as he made it, melted the last of Nora's resistance. All right, she said softly. I'll go to the dance with you. The smile that spread across Xander's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, radiant and full of promise. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her then and there. Instead, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Thank you, he said. And, in those simple words, Nora heard depths of meaning that made her heart swell. The moment was broken by the smell of the stew beginning to scorch. With a gasp, Nora turned back to the stove, lifting the pot from the heat. Xander chuckled, returning to his vegetable chopping, but the atmosphere between them had shifted irrevocably. Where there had been uncertainty, now there was possibility, tentative and new, but undeniably present. As they sat down to dinner a short time later, Nora found herself studying Xander openly, seeing him not as a temporary helper, but as a man who might have a place in her future. The realization was both exhilarating and frightening. She'd grown so accustomed to her independence, to making decisions without considering anyone else, that the prospect of sharing her life seemed almost foreign. Yet watching him across the table, laughing at something she'd said, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way she'd come to find endearing, Nora couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her at the thought of him staying, not just for a week or a month, but perhaps permanently. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey, unexpected, but right. The next day dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn morning. Nora woke early, as was her habit, and was surprised to find that Xander had beaten her to the kitchen. He stood by the stove, his back to her, humming softly as he prepared coffee. "Morning," she said, and he turned with a smile that made her heart skip. "Good morning," he replied. "I was thinking we might ride into town today, if you're agreeable. I'd like to speak with Sheriff Miller about what's happening with Wilcox, and you mentioned needing supplies." Nora hesitated. She rarely went to town unless absolutely necessary, preferring to avoid the stares and whispers that often followed her. But with Xander by her side, perhaps it wouldn't be so uncomfortable. "All right," she agreed, "but we should finish the morning chores first." They worked efficiently, and by mid-morning were ready to depart. As they rode side by side down the road toward Promise Creek, Nora found herself surprisingly relaxed. The knowledge that Wilcox's immediate threat had been neutralized lifted a weight she hadn't fully recognized was there. And Xander's presence beside her was reassuring, in a way she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. Promise Creek was a small but growing settlement, with a main street boasting a general store, saloon, bank, livery stable, and the sheriff's office. As they rode in, Nora was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. It had been months since she'd come to town, and never before with a man at her side. They hitched their horses outside the general store, and Xander offered his arm in a gentlemanly gesture that made Nora smile despite herself. As they entered, Martha Wilson's face lit up with delight. "Nora, and Mr. Thornton, what a lovely surprise!" she exclaimed, coming around the counter to greet them. "I was just telling Thomas this morning that I hoped you'd take my advice about coming to town." Thomas Wilson, a tall, lean man with kind eyes, nodded in greeting. "Miss Valens, good to see you. And you must be the man who's been helping out at the ranch." Xavier Thornton, Xander confirmed, shaking Thomas's hand. Pleasure to meet you, sir. As Martha drew Nora into conversation about the upcoming harvest dance and the latest town gossip, Xander browsed the store, occasionally adding items to the list of supplies Nora had prepared. There was something so domestic about the scene, the two of them shopping together, consulting on purchases, that Nora found herself imagining other such outings, a shared future extending beyond the immediate present. After completing their purchases and arranging for delivery of the heavier items, they made their way to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, a stocky man with a graying mustache and perpetually suspicious eyes, looked up in surprise as they entered. "Miss Valens," he acknowledged with a nod. "Unusual to see you in town." "Sheriff," Nora replied coolly, "I understand there's been some excitement recently involving the Wilcox Ranch." Miller's gaze shifted to Xander, narrowing slightly. "And you would be?" "Xavier Thornton," Xander answered. "I'm staying at Miss Valens's ranch, helping with repairs." Understanding dawned in Miller's eyes. "Ah, you'd be the stranger folks have been talking about." He leaned back in his chair, studying Xander more carefully. "Something about you seems familiar. Have we met before?" "I don't believe so," Xander replied evenly. "I'm just passing through your town." Miller grunted, clearly not entirely satisfied with the answer. "Well, what can I do for you two?" "We heard about the arrests," Nora said. "Martha Wilson mentioned Judge Harmon is looking into Wilcox's activities." "That's right," Miller confirmed, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely pleased with the development. "Judge received some letter with accusations against Wilcox. Came riding in here like the place was on fire, demanding action." "And you found evidence to support the accusations?" Xander asked. Miller shot him a hard look. "Found two of Wilcox's men threatening old Jenkins with bodily harm if he didn't sell his farm. Had to arrest them, with the judge standing right there." He sighed. "Wilcox isn't happy about it, I can tell you that." "Has he made any threats?" Nora asked, concerned. "Not directly," Miller said. "But he's been asking questions about who might have written to the judge." His gaze fixed on Xander. "Seems to think it was someone new to the area." "Interesting theory," Xander commented, his expression revealing nothing. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only when the door opened and another man entered, Judge Harmon himself, a dignified figure in his 60s with piercing blue eyes and an air of uncompromising authority. "Sheriff Miller," the judge acknowledged, then noticed the visitors. "Miss Valens, isn't it? Thomas Valens's daughter?" "Yes, sir," Nora replied, surprised to be recognized. "This is Xavier Thornton." The judge studied Xander intently. "Thornton. The name is familiar." "Judge," Xander said with a respectful nod. "I believe we may have corresponded recently." Understanding dawned in the judge's eyes. "Ah, I see. Well, Mr. Thornton, your letter was most informative. I'd like to speak with you further about what you've observed." Sheriff Miller's expression darkened as he realized Xander was the anonymous letter writer. "Now see here, Judge." "Sheriff, I'd like a private word with Mr. Thornton, if you don't mind," Judge Harmon interrupted firmly. "Perhaps you could show Miss Valens those wanted posters that came in yesterday? See if she's noticed any suspicious characters around her property." Though clearly unhappy, Miller had no choice but to comply with the judge's request. He led Nora to the other side of the office while Judge Harmon drew Xander into a quiet conversation. "Don't know what your friend thinks he's doing? Stirring up trouble with Wilcox," Miller muttered to Nora as he half-heartedly showed her the posters. "Man like that has friends in high places." "A man like that should still answer to the law, Sheriff," Nora replied calmly. "Or don't you believe that applies equally to everyone?" Miller's face reddened, but before he could respond, Judge Harmon called him back. "Sheriff, Mr. Thornton has provided me with additional information that corroborates what we already suspected about Wilcox's activities. I'll be expanding my investigation accordingly." The judge turned to Nora. "Miss Valens, I understand you've experienced some threatening behavior as well. A rock through your window, perhaps?" Surprised, Nora glanced at Xander, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Yes, Your Honor. Last week. There was a note telling me to leave my ranch." "And did you report this to Sheriff Miller?" the judge asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No, sir," Nora admitted. "I didn't believe anything would come of it." Judge Harmon's gaze turned to Miller, who shifted uncomfortably. "I see. Well, that will change moving forward. Sheriff Miller has assured me that all complaints will be thoroughly investigated, regardless of who makes them or who they concern." The emphasis he placed on the words left no doubt that Miller had received a stern lecture on his duties. "Yes, Your Honor," Miller muttered. "Good," the judge said. "Now, Miss Valens, Mr. Thornton, thank you for your time. I may call on you both for formal statements as my investigation progresses." As they left the sheriff's office, Nora felt a mixture of relief and concern. The judge's interest was encouraging, but Wilcox wouldn't take this challenge to his authority lightly. "Do you think it was wise to reveal yourself as the letter writer?" she asked Xander as they walked toward the livery stable where they'd left their horses. "Judge Harmon is a good man with a strong sense of justice," Xander replied. "Having him know the full story serves our interests better than anonymity at this point." "But Wilcox will figure it out soon enough," Nora pointed out. "He could come after you directly." Xander stopped walking, turning to face her. His expression was serious but unworried. "Nora, I've dealt with men like Wilcox before. They thrive on intimidation, but they rarely act directly when the law is watching them closely. Judge Harmon has put Wilcox on notice, and that changes the equation." "I hope you're right," Nora said, unable to shake her concern. "But please be careful. I don't want you getting hurt because of me." Xander's face softened, and he reached out to take her hand. "I'm being careful," he assured her. "And it's not because of you. It's because it's the right thing to do." He hesitated, then added, "Though I won't deny that protecting you is a powerful motivation." The simple honesty of his statement, and the warmth of his hand around hers, sent a flush to Nora's cheeks. She was saved from having to respond by the approach of Martha Wilson, who was hurrying toward them with an excited expression. "Nora, I was hoping to catch you before you left town," Martha called. "I've just received the most wonderful new fabric that would make a perfect dress for the harvest dance. You simply must see it." Before Nora could protest, Martha had linked arms with her and was leading her toward the general store, chattering enthusiastically about styles and patterns. Xander followed, an amused smile playing on his lips. Inside, Martha proudly displayed a bolt of deep green fabric with a subtle pattern woven into it. "Isn't it lovely? With your coloring, it would be absolutely perfect. And there's just enough time to have Mrs. Foster sew it up for the dance." Nora ran her fingers over the fabric, surprised by how much she liked it. It had been years since she'd had a new dress made, years since she'd cared enough about her appearance to bother with such things. But the thought of attending the dance with Xander, of seeing appreciation in his eyes when he looked at her. "It is beautiful," she admitted. "You should get it," Xander said quietly from behind her. When she turned to look at him, the warmth in his eyes made her heart skip. "Green suits you?" Martha beamed triumphantly. "Then it's settled. I'll have Mrs. Foster come by tomorrow to take your measurements. She can have it ready by next week. Plenty of time before the dance." Before Nora quite knew what was happening, the purchase had been arranged, and Martha was promising to send Mrs. Foster out to the ranch the following afternoon. As they finally made their way back to their horses, Nora found herself both excited and nervous about the prospect of the dance. "I haven't attended a social event in town since before my father died." she confessed as Xander helped her mount. I'm not sure I remember how to behave in polite company. Xander smiled up at her. You'll be wonderful, he assured her. And I'll be right beside you the whole time. The confidence in his voice and the promise in his words carried Nora through the ride home and into the evening. As they settled into their now familiar routine of shared dinner and quiet companionship by the fire, she found herself watching Xander, trying to reconcile the man she'd first met guarded, cautious, clearly running from something with the man who now sat across from her, open and increasingly at ease. Penny for your thoughts, Xander said, catching her gaze. Nora smiled. I was just thinking how different you seem from the man who appeared at my creek that first day. Different how? He asked, setting aside the piece of wood he'd been whittling. More settled, she replied, searching for the right words. Less like someone looking over his shoulder and more like someone looking forward. Xander nodded thoughtfully. That's a fair observation. I feel different. He met her eyes directly. Being here, with you, it's changed something for me, Nora. The earnestness in his voice made her breath catch. Changed what? My perspective, he said simply. When I left Colorado, I was angry, disillusioned. I'd lost faith in the system I'd dedicated myself to upholding. All I wanted was to get away, to forget. He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. But these past days, working beside you, seeing your determination to stand your ground and build something meaningful, it's reminded me of why I became a lawman in the first place. Nora swallowed, moved by his words. And why was that? To protect what matters, Xander said softly. To stand for what's right, even when it's difficult. You've been doing that all along, Nora. Watching you has inspired me. A flush of pleasure warmed her cheeks at the compliment. I've just been trying to survive. It's more than that, Xander insisted. You could have sold this place, taken the easy path. Instead, you've faced every challenge with courage and integrity. That's rare, Nora, and extraordinary. The way he looked at her, as though she were something precious and remarkable, made Nora's heart ache with a sweet longing she'd almost forgotten was possible. She'd been alone for so long, convinced that independence meant solitude, that the tenderness in Xander's gaze felt almost overwhelming. I should check on the horses before turning in, she said abruptly, needing a moment to compose herself. Xander nodded, seeming to understand her need for space. I'll bank the fire. Outside, in the cool night air, Nora took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The barn was peaceful, the soft nickering of the horses a familiar, comforting sound. She moved from stall to stall, checking water buckets and making sure everything was secure for the night. When she reached Willow's stall, she found the mare already had company. Xander stood stroking the horse's nose, speaking to her in low, gentle tones. He hadn't heard Nora approach, and for a moment, she simply watched him, the ease with which he handled the normally skittish mare, the tenderness in his touch. She really does like you, Nora said softly, making her presence known. Xander turned, a smile lighting his features. She's a good judge of character, you said. The best, Nora agreed, stepping closer. She reached out to stroke Willow's mane, her hand brushing against Xander's in the process. Neither pulled away, and for a moment they stood side by side, their fingers barely touching as they attended to the horse. Nora, Xander said quietly, turning to face her. In the lantern light, his eyes were deep and serious. I need to tell you something. Her heart quickened. What is it? My week here is almost up, he began, and I've been thinking about what comes next. A knot formed in Nora's stomach. Despite their conversation about the dance, despite the growing connection between them, she'd been trying not to think about his inevitable departure. I understand, she said, her voice carefully neutral. You need to move on. No, Xander said firmly, taking her hand in his. That's just it. I don't want to move on. Not from here. His eyes held hers, intent and honest. Not from you. Nora's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to stay, Xander replied simply. If you'll have me, not just as a hired hand, though I'd happily work this ranch beside you, but as... He hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. As someone who cares deeply for you, someone who wants to build something with you, if you're willing. For a moment Nora couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the honesty of his declaration and the hope it kindled within her. Xander, she finally managed, we've known each other barely a week. I know, he acknowledged, and I'm not asking for promises, not yet. Just a chance. To see if what I feel, what I think we both feel, might grow into something lasting. The vulnerability in his expression, the raw hope, touched something deep within Nora. For years, she'd convinced herself that she was content alone, that she needed no one. Yet standing here, with this man who looked at her as though she were the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life, she couldn't maintain that pretense. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Not of you, but of this, of wanting something I might lose. Xander's hand gently cupped her cheek. I understand fear, Nora. I've lived with it, fought against it. But I've learned that sometimes, the things worth having are worth the risk of losing them. His words resonated within her, echoing truths she'd long denied. Hadn't she risked everything to keep this ranch, because it mattered to her? Wasn't this man, with his quiet strength and unwavering integrity, worth at least equal courage? Slowly, Nora raised her hand to cover his where it rested against her cheek. Yes, she said simply. Stay. Let's see where this leads. The smile that broke across Xander's face was like sunrise after a long night. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward until his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. His arms encircled her, drawing her close, and Nora found herself responding with a passion that surprised her, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of his embrace. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xander rested his forehead against hers. Thank you, he whispered. For what? Nora asked, her arms still around his neck. For taking a chance on me, he replied, for being brave enough to let me in. Nora smiled, a lightness in her heart she hadn't felt in years. We're being brave together, she said. That makes it easier. They stood there in the quiet of the barn, holding each other as the lantern cast golden light around them and the horses shifted peacefully in their stalls. It was a simple moment, unremarkable by most standards. Yet Nora knew she would remember it always the moment she chose to open her heart again, to believe in possibilities beyond solitude. Later, as they walked hand in hand back to the house, the stars spread in a brilliant canopy overhead. Nora felt a sense of rightness settle over her. There were still challenges ahead, Wilcox's threats, the town's judgment. The practical matters of integrating their lives but facing them together seemed infinitely more manageable than facing them alone. The days that followed took on a new rhythm, colored by the acknowledged feelings between them. Xander moved from the tack room to the small spare bedroom in the house, a concession to propriety that neither of them particularly cared about, but which would matter if they wished to be accepted by the town. Mrs. Foster arrived as promised to measure Nora for her new dress, clucking with satisfaction over the green fabric and offering knowing smiles when Xander expressed interest in the process. The seamstress, a widow herself who had remarried late in life, seemed genuinely pleased by the development. It does my heart good to see you with someone worthy, Miss Valens, she said quietly while taking Nora's measurements. Your father would approve, I think. The comment brought unexpected tears to Nora's eyes. "I hope so," she replied softly. "I miss his counsel, especially now." Mrs. Foster patted her arm sympathetically. "He raised you to be strong and discerning. Trust the judgment he helped you develop." It was good advice, and Nora took it to heart as she and Xander began planning for a future together. They spent long evenings discussing practical matters: how to expand the ranch operations, improvements to make before winter set in, how to handle Wilcox's continued, if diminished, threat. But they also talked of more personal things: their childhoods, their hopes, the experiences that had shaped them. Nora learned about Xander's strict but loving parents, his competitive relationship with his brothers, his first fumbling attempts at law enforcement in a small Missouri town. In turn, she shared memories of her mother before her illness, her father's patient teaching, her dreams of breeding horses fine enough to compete with the best stock back east. With each conversation, each shared story, the connection between them deepened, transforming from attraction and mutual respect into something Nora could only describe as love, though neither had yet spoken the word aloud. 4 days before the harvest dance, Judge Harmon rode out to the ranch, accompanied by Sheriff Miller, who looked distinctly uncomfortable to be there. The judge requested formal statements from both Nora and Xander regarding Wilcox's threatening behavior, explaining that his investigation had uncovered a pattern of intimidation throughout the county. "I believe we have enough evidence to bring formal charges against Wilcox," the judge informed them as they sat at Nora's kitchen table. "His men have been quite informative once they realized the alternative was a lengthy prison sentence." "Will that be enough to stop him?" Nora asked, remembering the cold determination in Clyde Wilcox's eyes. "It should curtail his activities significantly," Judge Harmon replied, "especially as I've been in contact with the territorial governor about the situation. Wilcox's political connections may not be as useful as he believes." Sheriff Miller, who had remained largely silent, finally spoke up. "Miss Valens, I owe you an apology. I should have taken your concerns more seriously." He glanced at Xander, then back to Nora. "Rest assured, your ranch will receive the same protection as any other property in my jurisdiction from now on." The admission clearly cost Miller some pride, and Nora appreciated the effort, however belated. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "I'm glad to hear it." After the officials departed, Xander wrapped his arms around Nora from behind as they stood on the porch watching the men ride away. "Progress," he murmured against her hair. "Thanks to you," Nora replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "If you hadn't written to the judge, if I hadn't met you, I might never have found the courage to stand up for what's right again," Xander countered, turning her in his arms to face him. "You've changed me, Nora Valens, for the better, I think." The tenderness in his gaze made her heart swell. "We've changed each other," she said softly. "I was so certain I needed to face everything alone. You showed me there's strength in sharing burdens, too." Xander smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way she'd grown to love. "Speaking of sharing," he said, his tone becoming more serious, "there's something I want to ask you." Nora's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Taking her hand, Xander led her to the porch swing her father had built years ago. As they sat side by side, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a carved wooden horse, exquisitely detailed despite its small size. "I made this for you," he said, placing it in her palm. "Willow was my model." Nora examined the carving, marveling at the delicate workmanship. Every detail was perfect, from the flowing mane to the proud stance. "It's beautiful, Xander. I didn't realize you were so talented." "My grandfather taught me," he explained, "said a man should be able to create beauty as well as protect it." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "Nora, I know it's soon, perhaps too soon by conventional standards. but I've never been more certain of anything than I am of my feelings for you." Nora's breath caught as she realized where this conversation was heading. "Xander." He took her hand, the wooden horse cradled between their palms. "I love you, Nora Valens. These past weeks have shown me that what matters in life isn't a badge or a title or what others think of you. It's having someone to stand beside, someone who makes you want to be better than you are." His voice was steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "I want to build a life with you here, on this land you love so much. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to share your burdens and your joys, for as long as we both shall live." Tears filled Nora's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming happiness. In this man, she'd found something she'd never expected to find: a partner who respected her strength even as he offered his own, who saw her completely and loved what he saw. "I love you too," she whispered, the words easier to say than she'd imagined. "And yes, it's soon, but it's also right. I feel it in my heart, Xander. You belong here, with me." Relief and joy suffused his features. "Then, Nora Valens, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Thornton." He kissed her then, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, tender yet passionate, a perfect balance that reflected the partnership they were building. When they finally parted, both were smiling, their hearts fuller than either had believed possible just weeks before. "What will the town say?" Nora wondered, not because she particularly cared, but because she was curious how Xander felt about inevitable gossip. He laughed, the sound rich and carefree. "They'll say I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming territory, and they'll be absolutely right." The days leading up to the harvest dance passed in a blur of happiness. Mrs. Foster delivered Nora's dress, exclaiming with satisfaction over how beautifully it fit and how the color brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. Xander's admiration when she tried it on made her blush like a girl, unaccustomed to being looked at with such open appreciation. They decided to announce their engagement at the dance, agreeing that a public declaration would put to rest any lingering concerns about propriety. Judge Harmon, who had returned once more to update them on the case against Wilcox, readily agreed to officiate at their wedding, suggesting a date in early November before the worst of the winter weather set in. The evening of the dance arrived clear and cool, with a full moon rising over the mountains as Xander and Nora rode into town. The schoolhouse, which served as the venue for such community events, was festively decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the gathering crowd. As they entered, Nora was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations their arrival prompted. It had been so long since she'd participated in a town function that her presence alone would have caused a stir. Appearing on Xander's arm, in a new dress no less, was guaranteed to set tongues wagging. Martha Wilson hurried over to greet them, her face alight with pleasure. "Nora, you look absolutely stunning. And Mr. Thornton, so handsome in your suit. I'm so glad you both came." "Wouldn't have missed it," Xander replied with a smile, his hand resting lightly at the small of Nora's back in a gesture both protective and possessive. As the evening progressed, Nora found herself gradually relaxing. The music was lively, the refreshments plentiful, and Xander remained steadfastly by her side, introducing himself to townsfolk and answering their sometimes too personal questions with good-humored patience. Several people who had previously been cool toward Nora made efforts to be welcoming, perhaps influenced by Judge Harmon's presence at the event and his obvious approval of both Nora and Xander. When the band struck up a waltz, Xander led Nora onto the dance floor. She'd worried that her dancing skills, long unused, might have deserted her, but in his arms, she moved with surprising grace. You dance beautifully, Xander murmured as they circled the floor. Another hidden talent. My father insisted I learn, Nora replied with a small smile. Said every young lady should know how to dance, even if she lived on a ranch miles from civilization. A wise man, your father, Xander said, his eyes warm with admiration. I wish I could have met him. He would have liked you, Nora assured him. He valued honesty and hard work above all else. You have both in abundance. As the dance ended, Judge Harmon approached them, a glass of punch in his hand. Miss Valens, Mr. Thornton, you both look well. I'm pleased to see you enjoying yourselves. Thank you, Judge, Xander replied. Your presence here tonight means a lot to us. The judge smiled. I wouldn't have missed it, especially as I understand there might be an announcement forthcoming. Nora and Xander exchanged glances, and Xander nodded slightly. Indeed there is, Your Honor. Would now be an appropriate time? I believe so, the judge agreed. Allow me to assist. He moved to the small platform where the band was playing and raised his hand for attention. As the music stopped and the crowd quieted, he spoke in his carrying voice. Ladies and gentlemen of Promise Creek, I hope you're all enjoying this fine harvest celebration. I have the honor tonight of sharing some happy news from two members of our community. He gestured for Nora and Xander to join him. Miss Nora Valens and Mr. Xavier Thornton have announced their engagement and intend to be married in November. I will have the privilege of officiating at the ceremony. A moment of surprised silence was followed by a wave of applause and congratulations. Martha Wilson was openly wiping tears from her eyes, while her husband Thomas nodded approvingly. Even Sheriff Miller, standing near the refreshment table, raised his glass in acknowledgement. As they stepped down from the platform, they were surrounded by well-wishers, many expressing genuine happiness for Nora, who had been alone for so long. Mrs. Foster patted her hand affectionately, whispering, I knew it the moment I saw you together. Such a perfect match. The celebration continued, with several older ladies already discussing wedding preparations and offering assistance that Nora, overwhelmed by the sudden acceptance, gratefully accepted. Xander remained by her side throughout, his steady presence a comfort amid the whirl of activity. It was late in the evening as the dance was winding down when Sheriff Miller approached them again, his expression unusually grave. Miss Valens, Mr. Thornton, a word if I might, he said, leading them to a quieter corner of the room. I've just received some troubling news. Clyde Wilcox has disappeared. Nora tensed. Disappeared? Left his ranch sometime yesterday, according to his foreman, Miller explained. Took his best horse and a rifle. Said something about settling scores before the judge's hearing next week. Xander's arm tightened around Nora's waist. You think he's coming after us? It wasn't a question, and Miller didn't treat it as one. I think it's a strong possibility. The man's facing serious charges, largely due to evidence you both provided. He's not known for his forgiving nature. What are you doing about it? Xander asked, his voice taking on the authority of his former position. I've got men watching the roads, Miller replied, and I'll be riding out to your ranch myself tomorrow to check the surroundings. In the meantime, I'd advise you both to be extremely cautious. Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. The idea of Wilcox, armed and desperate, seeking revenge, cast a shadow over what had been a perfect evening. Thank you for the warning, Sheriff, she said. We'll be careful. As they rode home later, the earlier jubilation of the evening was tempered by this new concern. Xander rode close beside her, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness around them, one hand never far from his gun. We should be all right tonight, he said as they approached the ranch, the buildings dark and silent in the moonlight. Miller said Wilcox left yesterday. He wouldn't have had time to reach us yet. Not if he's trying to avoid the main roads where the sheriff's men are watching. Nora nodded, though anxiety still gnawed at her. We'll take precautions tomorrow. Check the boundaries. Make sure the horses are kept close to the barn. They secured the horses and entered the house, moving through the rooms together to light lamps and check that all was as they'd left it. Once satisfied, Xander built up the fire while Nora made tea, the familiar domestic actions helping to restore a sense of normalcy. Sitting together before the fire, Nora leaned against Xander's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I won't let fear ruin this happiness we've found," she said resolutely. "Wilcox has taken enough from people in this county. He won't take this too." Xander pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's my brave Nora," he murmured. "And you're right. We'll face whatever comes together, just as we've faced everything else." They stayed like that for a long while, talking quietly about the dance, about their wedding plans, about the future they would build together, deliberately focusing on hope rather than fear. When they finally retired to their separate bedrooms, Xander lingered at Nora's door, his goodnight kiss conveying all the love and reassurance words couldn't express. Despite her determination not to give in to fear, Nora slept fitfully that night, waking at every creak and rustle of the old house. The morning dawned gray and overcast, matching her mood as she rose early to begin the day's chores. She was feeding the chickens when Xander emerged from the house, his hair still damp from washing. "Morning," he called, crossing the yard to join her. "How did you sleep?" "Not well," Nora admitted. "Too many shadows seemed to move in the dark." Xander nodded in understanding. "I know the feeling, but daylight helps." He glanced at the overcast sky, such as it is today. They worked together through the morning, staying within sight of each other and the house. Sheriff Miller arrived midday as promised, accompanied by 2 deputies. They rode the boundaries of Nora's property, checking for any signs of intrusion, but found nothing suspicious. "Doesn't mean Wilcox isn't planning something," Miller cautioned as they returned to the house. "But he hasn't been here yet. I've got men watching the main approaches to your ranch, and we'll continue patrols for the next few days." "We appreciate it, Sheriff," Xander said, offering the man coffee. "It's good to know the law is on our side in this matter." Miller accepted the coffee with a nod. "Judge Harmon made it clear this is a priority. Besides," he added with a glance at Nora, "it's past time I did my job properly for all citizens of this county." After the sheriff and his men departed, the day passed quietly. Xander worked on reinforcing the barn doors while Nora attended to her correspondence, including writing to Xander's family in Missouri to share news of their engagement. The domestic peace of the scene almost made it possible to forget the threat hanging over them, though both remained vigilant. As evening approached, Xander insisted on checking the property one more time before darkness fell completely. "I'll just ride the north boundary," he told Nora. "Won't be long." "Be careful," Nora said, unable to shake a sense of unease. "Take the rifle." He kissed her reassuringly. "I will. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me." After Xander rode out, Nora secured the house as promised, then busied herself preparing dinner. The stew was simmering nicely, filling the kitchen with savory aromas, when she heard a horse approaching. Relieved that Xander had returned so quickly, she moved to the window to greet him. But the rider coming up the road wasn't Xander. Even in the fading light, she could recognize Clyde Wilcox's bulky form. Fear surged through her, quickly followed by determination. She reached for her father's rifle, checking that it was loaded before positioning herself near the window where she could see, without being easily seen. Wilcox dismounted in the yard, his movements suggesting he'd been drinking. He swayed slightly as he surveyed the property, then called out in a voice slurred with alcohol and rage. "Valens, come out here, you stubborn woman. You and that interfering bastard have caused me enough trouble." Nora remained silent, watching as Wilcox paced the yard, becoming increasingly agitated. "I know you're in there," he shouted. "Too afraid to face me? You should be. I built everything I have, and no woman and some drifter are going to take it away. He drew his pistol, and for a terrifying moment, Nora thought he might start shooting at the house. Instead, he turned toward the barn where the horses were stabled. Maybe you'll come out if I start with those precious horses of yours. Cold dread filled Nora's stomach. She couldn't let him harm her horses, but confronting an armed, drunk Wilcox alone was madness. Where was Xander? Had Wilcox encountered him on the property? The thought that Xander might be hurt or worse made her heart clench painfully. Before she could decide on a course of action, movement caught her eye. Xander, approaching stealthily from the side of the barn, his rifle raised. He must have returned from his ride and spotted Wilcox from a distance, choosing to circle around rather than confront him directly. Relief flooded through Nora, quickly followed by renewed fear as Wilcox turned toward the barn door, his back to Xander, but his gun still drawn. If he entered the barn and discovered Xander's horse, he'd know they weren't alone on the property. Nora made a split-second decision. Opening the door just enough to be heard, she called out, "Wilcox, I'm here. Leave my horses alone." Wilcox whirled, his gun pointing toward the house. "There you are," he slurred. "Come out where I can see you." "Put your gun away first," Nora replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm unarmed." A lie, but one she hoped would make Wilcox lower his weapon. "Like hell you are," Wilcox sneered. "Everyone knows Thomas Valens taught his daughter to shoot before she could walk." He staggered a few steps closer to the house. "Where's your man, Valens? Hiding inside while you face me? Some protector he is?" "He's not here." Nora lied again, watching as Xander used the distraction to move closer, staying in the shadows. Wilcox laughed harshly. "Better for him if that's true. I've got plans for him too, once I'm done with you." The threat, coupled with the wild look in Wilcox's eyes, sent a chill through Nora. This wasn't just intimidation, the man truly meant to do them harm. "It's over, Wilcox," she said, trying to reason with him despite knowing it was likely futile. "Judge Harmon has all the evidence he needs. Hurting me won't change that." "Maybe not," Wilcox agreed, surprisingly lucid for a moment. "But it'll sure make me feel better." He raised his gun, aiming directly at the doorway where Nora stood partially concealed. "Say goodbye to your precious ranch, Valens." Before he could pull the trigger, Xander's voice rang out from behind him. "Drop the gun, Wilcox. Sheriff's office." Startled, Wilcox spun around, his gun still raised. Xander stood in plain view now, his rifle aimed steadily at Wilcox's chest. "You," Wilcox snarled. "Should have known you'd be skulking around. You're not a real lawman anymore, Thornton. That badge you're pretending to have doesn't mean anything." "The rifle is real enough," Xander replied calmly, "and Sheriff Miller and his deputies are on their way. They've been patrolling the area, looking for you." For a moment, indecision warred in Wilcox's face. Then, with a roar of fury, he swung his gun toward Xander. Nora's heart seemed to stop as two shots rang out almost simultaneously. Wilcox staggered backward, clutching his arm where Xander's bullet had struck him. His own shot had gone wild, burying itself harmlessly in the ground. "You shot me," Wilcox bellowed, more outraged than pained. "You actually shot me." "Be grateful I aimed for your arm," Xander replied, keeping his rifle trained on the wounded man. "Drop the gun, Wilcox. It's finished." Whether it was the pain, the realization of his situation, or simply the effects of the alcohol, something seemed to drain out of Wilcox then. He let his pistol fall to the ground, sinking to his knees beside it. "It's not right," he muttered, pressing his hand against his bleeding arm. "A man works his whole life to build something, and the law turns against him." "The law didn't turn against you," Xander corrected, moving forward cautiously to retrieve Wilcox's dropped weapon. "You turned against the law when you decided it didn't apply to you." Nora emerged from the house, her own rifle still in hand as she approached them. The sight of Xander standing unharmed filled her with such profound relief that she felt momentarily weak. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes scanning him for any sign of injury. "I'm fine," he assured her, his gaze briefly softening as it met hers before returning to Wilcox. "We should bind his wound until the sheriff arrives." Together, they managed to get Wilcox into the house and seated at the kitchen table. Nora fetched bandages while Xander kept watch over their now subdued prisoner. The bullet had only grazed Wilcox's upper arm, painful but not serious. As Nora cleaned and bandaged the wound, Wilcox remained uncharacteristically quiet, the fight gone out of him. The sound of approaching horses announced Sheriff Miller's arrival, along with several deputies. The sheriff's eyebrows rose at the scene in Nora's kitchen, Wilcox bandaged and sullen, Xander standing guard, Nora calmly putting away medical supplies. "Seems we missed the excitement," Miller observed dryly. "Just doing your job for you, Sheriff," Xander replied, without rancor. "Wilcox here decided to pay us a visit. Made some threats, then pulled a gun." Miller turned to Wilcox. "That true, Clyde?" Wilcox didn't respond, staring fixedly at the tabletop. One of the deputies moved forward to help him to his feet. "We'll take him into custody," Miller said. "Judge Harmon will want to add this to his list of charges." He glanced at Xander, something like respect in his eyes. "Good shooting. Most men would have aimed for the center." "I'm not most men," Xander said simply. As the deputies led Wilcox outside, Miller lingered a moment longer. "You two all right? That was a close call." "We're fine, Sheriff," Nora assured him, thanks to Xander's quick thinking. Miller nodded. "Well, I'll need formal statements from both of you tomorrow, but it can wait until then. Get some rest. You've earned it." After the sheriff and his men had departed with their prisoner, Nora and Xander stood in the kitchen, the reality of what had just occurred washing over them. Without a word, Nora moved into Xander's arms, burying her face against his chest as he held her tightly. "I was so afraid," she whispered, "when I saw him turn his gun on you." "I know," Xander murmured, his cheek resting against her hair. "But it's over now. He can't threaten us anymore." They stayed like that for a long while, holding each other, reassuring themselves with the solid reality of each other's presence. Eventually, Nora stepped back, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "The stew is probably ruined," she said with a weak attempt at humor. Xander smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not particularly hungry anyway. Are you?" Nora shook her head. "No. Just tired. It's been a long day." "Then let's just sit by the fire for a while," Xander suggested, leading her to the living room where embers still glowed in the hearth. He built up the fire while Nora settled on the sofa, then joined her, drawing her against his side. The crackling of the flames and the solid warmth of Xander beside her gradually eased the last of the tension from Nora's body. The danger had passed. Wilcox was in custody, and with Judge Harmon's investigation already well advanced, it seemed unlikely he would trouble them again. "What happens now?" Nora asked softly, watching the dancing flames. "Now," Xander replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "We get married, as planned. We build our life together. We make this ranch into everything your father dreamed it could be, and more." The simplicity of his answer, and the certainty behind it, made Nora smile. "Just like that?" "Just like that," he confirmed. "Unless you've changed your mind?" Nora tilted her head up to look at him, seeing in his eyes all the love and commitment she could ever hope for. "Not a chance," she replied. "You're stuck with me, Xavier Thornton." "Thank God for that," he murmured, before lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future filled with possibility. 6 weeks later, on a clear, crisp November morning, Nora stood in her bedroom, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. The wedding dress Martha and Mrs. Foster had insisted on making for her was simple but elegant ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, a style that complemented Nora's slender frame perfectly. A soft knock at the door announced Martha's arrival. "Oh my!" the older woman exclaimed, her eyes filling with tears. "Nora, you are absolutely beautiful. Your father would be so proud." Nora smiled, touching the locket around her neck that contained a small portrait of her parents. "I like to think he's here in spirit." "I'm certain of it," Martha assured her, adjusting the small wreath of dried flowers that crowned Nora's upswept hair. "Now, are you ready? The guests are all seated, and that handsome groom of yours is looking rather nervous." The ceremony, held in Nora's front yard with the mountains as a backdrop, was simple and deeply moving. Judge Harmon officiated with dignified warmth, and the gathering of townsfolk and neighboring ranchers, larger than Nora had expected, bore witness to the union with evident approval. When Xander placed the ring on her finger, a delicate gold band that had belonged to his grandmother and promised to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life, Nora felt a certainty settle in her heart. This was right. This was where she belonged with this man, on this land, building a future together. The celebration afterward was joyous, with food, music, and dancing continuing well into the evening. Sheriff Miller attended, presenting them with a finely crafted clock as a wedding gift. Even Thomas Wilson danced, partnering his wife with surprising grace for such a tall man. As twilight deepened and the last guests departed, Xander and Nora stood on their porch, his arm around her waist, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton?" Xander asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Completely, Mr. Thornton," Nora replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still can't believe how much has changed in just a few months. From thinking no one would remember my birthday to having a husband and half the town as friends." Xander smiled, recalling the day they'd met her wariness, his uncertainty, the unexpected connection that had grown between them. "All because I left wildflowers on your table." "All because you saw me?" Nora corrected softly. "Really saw me, when I'd grown so used to being overlooked." "I'll never stop seeing you, Nora Thornton," Xander promised, turning her in his arms to face him. "Not for all the days of our lives." As he sealed the promise with a kiss, Nora knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home not just in the ranch she'd fought so hard to keep, but in the heart of the man who had helped her discover that independence and love could coexist beautifully, strengthening rather than diminishing each other. Together, they would build a future neither had imagined possible just months before, a future filled with hard work and joy, challenges and triumphs, and most of all, a love that had begun with wildflowers on a birthday table and would continue to bloom for all the seasons of their lives.